you can see, any of the three box bodies that we've constructed to this point would make a very attractive project. However, what most people are really intrigued by are these inlay or double joints, such as the double dovetails, the double box joints, and in this case, kind of a hybrid joint that's called a box tail. It's a dovetail with a box joint inside of it. The operation for all of the double joints is exactly the same as far as the process. So we're going to take a look at how these are formed on this particular type of joint. Cutting this joint is very similar to the other joints that we've made up to this point, except that this uses the templates that have extra cut lines for each part of the joint. For example, the other joints on a dovetail, we cut on one side of the dovetail, then we cut on the other. On this one, you'll notice that there are, on your templates, that there are generally two side-by-side cuts for each cut. So what you'll do is make like the cuts on the two long dashed black lines, then you'll make the cuts on the two long red lines, and then you'll come back and do the short black dashed lines and then the short red lines to get your final finish. Now, what we've done is gone through the symmetry alignment using the true center and the rabbet so that we are set up to begin making our first series of cuts on our stock. Your first series of cuts give you two pieces of stock that look something similar to this depending on the size bit that you're using. These were cut on the long black dashed lines. Now the second series of cuts will be made on the long red lines, following exactly the same process that we've used up till now. Now it's generally at this point, the first time around, that you put these two pieces together and you go, oh my, what have I done? And the reason why is because in all the joints that we've covered up to this point, the two pieces fit together perfectly. On this particular case, because these are the two preliminary cuts, they don't seem to fit together at all. Well, that's because what we're going to do next is cut the inlay pieces, which will then lock the joint together. You'll notice that the two pieces that I have installed into the vertical push fixture are shorter pieces of stock, and that's because these are the inlay pieces that will go with the walnut to give us our contrasting colors on the end of the joint. Now, the walnut pieces were cut using the long dashed black lines on the template. The corresponding cuts will be on the short solid black lines that are on the template. So we'll make our cuts on these pieces. Now, ultimately what we will do is to take these and cut them down the center so that we have 4 pieces. Then these will be glued and clamped onto the ends of the walnut pieces. Just like that. So this will be cut in half, and this piece will go up here. And we'll do that to both walnut pieces. Now, we also have 2 pieces of walnut that will be cut on the short solid red lines to make the mating stock to contrast the light colored pieces of wood we have here. Now we have our walnut pieces that match our light colored stock. And again, we would split these in half, cross grain, and glue one end onto each end of the light colored stock. One of the keys to making this joint look attractive is to have the inlay be of the same thickness throughout the entire pattern of the joint. Now in this case, our inlay strip will end up being 1/8 of an inch thick, and it should be 1/8 of an inch down here, 1/8 of an inch here, 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 and here throughout the entire joint. Now the way that I've shown you up to this point to cut this leaves a large piece of spare stock or scrap stock on the end that will need to be cut precisely at 1/8 of an inch. There is an alternate method that you can use which will help you to achieve the same end result and also get a little bit more use out of your stock. And that is this. The depth of cut for our particular joint is 9/16 of an inch on the router bit. So that means that we're going to come up in here 9/16 of an inch and then have 1/8 of an inch of different stock above that. That's a total of 11/16. So what we'll do is take a piece of stock 11/16 of an inch thick, and we'll run the same joint down the length. And that will leave us a piece of stock with exactly 1/8 of an inch at the top. So if you watch what I do here, you'll see exactly what I'm explaining. making the exterior cuts, you'll want to make sure that you make shallow cuts and take your time to help prevent splintering and also to help to prevent the piece of wood from wanting to pull. Now what you can see is that what we now have is a nice 1/8 inch thick lip all across our joint. And slide that together just like that, and that will give us the same end result, and we won't have to try to cut this piece to make it match perfectly. This will already have our exact 1/8 inch thickness for this particular part of the joint. The only downside to this is that when you slab these pieces off like cutting slices of bread, because of the end grain being very, very thin, this can split and crack across the grain easily. So you'll want to take your time when you go to assemble the joint. I've made a mark across the end of the accenting piece here, exactly 1/8 of an inch from the end of the walnut dovetail. And what we need to do is cut right at that line. Now, since both sides of the box have to be exactly the same length, you want to cut them at the same time, and that way they will come out, for good, bad, or indifferent, exactly the same length when the box is complete. Now then, all we have to do is flip the stock end for end, cut the other end, and then do the same thing to the two alternate sides. Whether you cut your inlay pieces in the vertical method or the horizontal method doesn't really matter. All you need to do is take the stock, glue it in place, make sure the glue is good and dry, sand the surfaces smooth so that everything's nice and even and square just like it was to begin with, and then return it to the clincher. Now, we have changed router bits. This is called a box tail. The first part was cut with a dovetail. The second part is cut just as you would a box joint with a straight router bit. This particular portion of the joint uses a 1/2 inch router bit. Now, one of the key dimensions here is that the router bit has to be exactly the same height as the thickness of the stock. You cannot, on this joint, allow for extra stock on the outside edges, because if you do, and then you sand away some of that extra stock that's protruding out, that will alter the thickness of your inlay once it's put together. Do not change the centering or the symmetry marks or anything on the system. Even though you're changing diameters of router bits, you're still going to have the same center line for your cuts. Now, our first series of cuts on this joint will be made on the short black dashed lines. That gives us our first set of cuts. Now we just take and move the clincher to the short, solid red lines and make our second set of cuts on the mating pieces. pieces and fit them together just like that. Up to this point, all of the joints on the boxes that we've looked at are all interlocking joints, where one side, by means of finger joints or dovetail joints, interlocks or locks into the mating piece for the adjacent side. However, some projects, either by design or by desire, are put together with 45-degree miters. But you may still want to have the visual effect of a fancy joint, such as a box joint or a dovetail joint. And you'll see here on our humidor, these actually five dovetails are splined dovetails. They're dovetails that are cut across at a 45-degree angle, and then a small key is placed in to give the accenting color. And what I'm going to do now is show you a quick way on the JoinTech clincher system to perform that operation. This is the spline miter jig for the JoinTech Smart Fence. We're going to use it to cut the spline dovetails in the corner of a small box. When you go to 0 for your symmetry, what you do is run the jig itself up against the bit rather than against the fence. At this point, you then set up your symmetry just like you would for all of the other cuts. So we'll take and clamp our box into place. Cut slowly, as you don't want to snap off the bit by trying to remove too much stock at a time, at one time. Complete your series of cuts by running all 4 corners of the box. To make the keys for our spline dovetail, we take a piece of contrasting stock and essentially run it across the face of the same router bit, flipping the board end for end each cut until we slowly sneak the fence back a little bit at a time to give us the thickness of the slotted dovetail key that we want. We'll use the feather boards to help keep the stock in against the fence so that it gets an even cut down the length of the board. By using the micrometer wheel, you can sneak up on the joint a few thousandths of an inch at a time until you get the exact fit that you want on your joint. Now all we need to do is take our piece of spline stock and test fit it by sliding it into one of the corner joints. You want it to fit a little on the snug side so that when the joint is assembled, that you'll have a nice, good, tight, clean fit in the corner, just like that. Now all you need to do is to take and slice these off in about 1.5 inch long pieces, glue them in the corners, and then sand them flat and smooth. This is our demo box that we made throughout the process of the video. All this really requires is a little bit of edge treatment on the base and the top, a little bit of finish sanding and some finish, and you'll have a nice, beautiful, completed storage box just like this one right here. I hope you found this tape to be useful and enjoyable, and will get many hours of use from your JoinTech clincher system.